what's the purpose of web scraping? Why did you want to learn about this? Yeah, for sure. Okay, so it's a method of data collection. That is one purpose of web scraping, right? Which brings us to the larger question, right, that I think a lot of you guys will be asking yourselves as you are working on projects, which is where do we get data from? Right? Web scraping is one method, but there's a variety of ways that we can collect data. And we can sort of break it out into two broader classes. You have what's referred to as primary data collection. And this is when you are actually going out and you are collecting or measuring the data yourself, right? Oftentimes, that's not going to be the case for us, at least working as a data analyst. Oftentimes, we try and rely more on secondary data collection, which is leveraging data that has already been collected in some form or fashion, right? So that's what we're going to be focusing on here is secondary data collection, which can be further broken down into two different ideas, right? Sometimes when you go out and look for data, that data has already been compiled in some form or fashion, right? So maybe you're working for a company, right? Or you're doing analysis for a client, and they already have data that's collected. Maybe it is in their database, right? And so it is just a matter of querying the necessary tables and compiling them into a data frame, right? Maybe you're less fortunate and the company that you're working for just has a big collection of loose Excel spreadsheets. That's not ideal, but the data already exists, right, in a nice structured format. There are also quite a few data sets that exist online through different open source repositories. Kaggle is one competitions website that I use pretty often for finding data sets across a really wide variety of topics. But sometimes the data that you want, you don't have the ability or the time to collect, right? So you're not going to do the primary data collection route, and the data hasn't already been compiled. But it might exist somewhere on the internet, right? There's a ton of data that exists out there on the internet. And you have the ability to compile it, at least in some cases, using a variety of methods, one of which is web scraping, and the other is leveraging what's called an API. So let's talk about the difference between those two things, right? Web scraping is the process of creating a crawler or a scraping function that you direct to a particular website or a set of websites, and then you will pull data down from those specified URLs. You can decide what data you want to pull down, whether you're going to pull down literally everything that's on that page, like the page source, or you can specify different sort of HTML elements, like just the body text, just the headers, just the images, just links on the websites, and so on, right? But you program a function, and you tell exactly where to go and exactly where to pull, right? What data to pull and how, right? Then you can bring it down. It's usually going to contain a bunch of messy HTML that needs to be cleaned up, right? But that is one way that you can go about grabbing data from the internet. There's also what we refer to as an API. That's short for Application Program Interface, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It is a way of programmatically interfacing with somebody else's application, right? So this is a way that we can sort of more officially request data or services from an existing company. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these pipelines in a bit more detail so we can understand sort of the pros and cons with going with either method. So let's start with the API pipeline, because I think it's a little bit more straightforward, okay? When we're talking about hitting an API and requesting data, typically we have to make an account, right? So maybe we go to Spotify and we create a developer account with Spotify. Once you have created a developer account, they're going to give you what are referred to as access credentials, right? This says, okay, you have a developer account with this organization, right? And they provide to you, again, credentials like a secret key that allow you to request data. You then will set up your request. Again, this is done programmatically in something like Python, where you specify what's referred to as a endpoint, right? Where you want your request to end up, right? And then you request the data that you want, right? I want, for example, say I am hitting like a news API. I can request that I want news articles that are related to Google, and I want them between today's date and 2 weeks prior, right? And that is the data that I want to request. We send that request to their API. If the request is approved, then the data will be sent back to you, typically in a JSON format, and then you can easily convert that back into a data frame. Bing, bang, boom, you have the data, right? If they don't like your request, if you're asking for data that you don't have access to, say in your particular tier, like if you're not paying for it, then they'll simply send back an error message that says request denied, right? But the key is you have their express permission to request the data, and they get to decide whether they send you the data or not, right? That is different from web scraping, right? And web scraping, you are doing this without the permission of that organization, right? You'll use a Python library like Selenium in order to actually program what we refer to as a crawler or a scraper, right? Again, this is the actual code that will command what we refer to as a browser driver, which will launch a browser like Google Chrome, navigate to that specific website, right? Crawl it, right? Pull down the data that you've specifically programmed into your scraper or crawler, right? It'll navigate to that website, and if it's successful, right, it'll send the data back, right? And you will be able to access it from that point, right? But again, key here is that this is not at the approval of that given organization, right? You are attempting to access that website, pull down the data you want, and if you're successful, you gather the data, right? But it is not with the permission of that given organization. So that brings me to the pros and cons of both of these different methods, okay? Web scraping is great in that it is free and it's customizable, right? You can write a crawler to do whatever you want if you have the programming capability, right? And it can be done for both static and dynamic web pages. The con with web scraping is that in the modern era, it is getting increasingly difficult to perform web scraping for a variety of reasons. One of which is that you have web pages that have dynamic elements, like you go to look at a New York Times article, right? There's going to be a pop-up almost immediately, right, that says, do you have an account, right? Or you go to a website and there's a pop-up and it asks you to select your cookie preferences, right? Most websites have some sort of dynamic component, right, that you have to click through before you can actually access the text or the data that you're looking for, right? That means if you want to program a crawler to get to that data, you have to program every step, right, of the window pops up, right? And you have to hover over the X to close out of it, or log into an account, or accept all cookies, or whatever, right? That is all done programmatically, right? You have to be able to bypass that to get to the data. Right, so that's one challenge, right, is that it's programmatically difficult. Another challenge is that in the modern era, companies are recognizing that their data is a commodity, right? Companies like Google and OpenAI are training large language models and other transformer-based models that they are selling to other people, right? They're training it on website data, and then they are charging for those models, right? So companies are realizing, hey, large language models have been trained on my data. I haven't been compensated for that, right? And so they're starting to put in more guards against people simply going to their website and pulling down all their data. And so if you go to many websites' terms of usage, they will have language that expressly forbids web scraping. The one that we're actually even going to include in the demo today is technically not legal. Technically not, but oh no, yeah, you're right. You're right. However, I'm going to put a caveat on that in that you're going to hit tabular data from a website. You're going to pull down like basically 500 rows of observations. They are less concerned about a student scraping for educational purposes than they are, again, a company like OpenAI hitting their servers hard pulling down all of their data to train some model for profit, right? So that's the caveat there. But again, it's something to keep in mind because you can get your IP address blocked, right, if you are caught scraping, which means you can no longer Andy can tell you about that. That's a different story, right? But that can happen. I decided to take a risk with this website because I don't care personally if my IP address gets blocked from thenumbers.com. I've never been to that website prior to this before, so you guys can decide whether you want to take the risk or not. It shouldn't be an issue, but just something to keep in mind. Just something to keep in mind. Okay. Also, additional con of web scraping is that depending on the type of data you're pulling down, let me see if I can get down to my, okay. So this is what you guys are going to be scraping, the numbers. Again, I literally don't care about this website at all, but it's a source of data. Here's our page source, right, which is basically, again, provides all of the HTML and such that decides like the layout and everything, right? If you were to write a super basic scraper, right, that just hits this website and pulls down the whole page source, which is what we're looking right here, this is everything that would get pulled in. Does that look fun to work with? It's kind of messy, right? And it's not to say that it's an impossible feat, right? There are Python libraries like Beautiful Soup that can help you do HTML parsing, but the data is not coming in a clean format naturally, right? You've got a lot of HTML to parse out of this to actually get to the data that you want to work with. So just, again, something to keep in mind there. What I prefer to do when I can is to work with an API. Right, that is always going to be my preference because I know I'm not going to be breaking the law, right? And the data often does come in a cleaner format, right? I'm setting up the request, I'm getting it back in a nice JSON format, and I can easily convert a JSON into a data frame. So I find it to be a much cleaner and a much more legal way of accessing data. So this is always going to be what I tend to default to unless I have like no other option, okay? So pros of APIs, usually easy to set up. The data come in a lot cleaner. You define the parameters of the type of data you want pulled in, how much data you want pulled in, the recency of the data you want pulled in addition to other parameters that you can set up. Main cons with an API, on an individual basis level, you're typically not going to be pulling in enough data that you're going to start to run up a bill. A lot of companies have free tiers of their APIs. So you're allowed to pull in up to 100, 300, 400 pull requests per day, right, or per minute, whatever, right? But you will be rate limited, right, at a free tier. But you should be able to pull in a decent amount of data for free. If you're working for an organization and you're pulling in data at greater scale, it can get expensive. So that's just something to keep in mind is the cost to use an API. And you are also going to be limited in the data that you can pull, right? So I brought up the Spotify API as an example before. You can set up the Spotify API for free, and you can access your listening data. You cannot access other people's listening data, right? Because they don't want people to try and like reverse engineer their recommendation algorithm. So you can only pull in your data. That is what you have access to, and you can't get access to other data, right? So you are going to be limited in that regard, okay? Are there any questions about this process or sort of the difference between web scraping, APIs, or how they work before I move over to the demo slide? All right, then go forth and scrape. I have put together a demo in Google Colab where the code has been provided for you to scrape 5 different tabs of tabular data from the numbers. It is going to be horror movie box office data for, I don't know, it's like 500 or so rows. So that scraper is already set up. You just have to run the code. And they also have included in this demo instructions for how to That's really going on. Okay.
The best way to do this is
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Google. And the other part of this demo gives you instructions for how to set up a developer account on TMDB, which is the movie database. It's just a movie database website. Set up an account, get your API credentials, and then set up an API pull request to pull in additional movie data. The idea with this challenge is, as Doug mentioned, right? Every year I participate in an October horror movie challenge where they will post a series of like 50 or so categories that you have to hit by watching various horror movies. There's categories that are related to the decade that the movie came out. There's things related to the director, actors that are involved, as well as just thematic elements that come up in the movie. The idea is that you guys are going to use a combination of scraping as well as API pull requests to gather together a large horror movie data set. And then you will come up with a programmatic solution to recommend to me a watch list. The key with this watch list is that I want it optimized because it's already halfway through October and I have to hit as many categories as I can by October 31st. So in order to win the competition, what you're striving for is hitting the greatest number of categories with the smallest number of movies. So you will recommend to me a watch list that contains those movies. You will have until end of day Wednesday to do so if you want to participate. There is candy on the line, and I think Doug also threw in a gift card and an Amazon gift card, right? And also just do it because bragging rights. And you can watch the watch list yourself if you want to participate too. Couple of key things before I bring it back to the QR slide. Scraping has to be done in a local Python environment. You can't do it from a cloud-based IDE like Google Colab, right? So the notebook is going to direct you to Google Colab because that was an easy way for me to share it with you, but you're going to need to make a copy and then download it, right? You can do it in Jupyter Notebooks, Jupyter Labs, VS Code, whatever, but it needs to be local so that it has the ability to access your browser driver, right? So it can actually launch Google Chrome to pull down the data. Does that make sense, guys? Okay, perfect. So it has to be done locally, at least the first part, right? Once you finish the scraping, you can switch back to a cloud-based IDE if you want. The winning solution has to be produced grammatically. You can totally use AI assistants to help you alter or generate additional code to come up with a solution. You cannot just copy and paste the categories into ChatGPT and ask it to recommend movies to you. I need to see that you actually programmatically recommended and compiled that movie list for me. Otherwise, it's not fun. That's way too easy to do with AI. You're going to add your watch list to the outline that's provided in the notebook. And again, just turn in your results. I have a Google form linked at the bottom of the notebook where you can turn in your notebook as well as the number of movies you landed on and the number of categories you think you hit. It is just at the very bottom here, a form that is linked. So turn in by end of day Wednesday if you want to be considered for the prize. It will be announced during Innovation Lab on Thursday. Any additional questions? All right, then go forth and do some creepy crawling.